Urgent question. Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Minister for the Cabinet Office to reconsider the decision to deny funding for legal assistance and advice to those affected by the contaminated blood scandal during the consultation on the terms of reference for the infected blood inquiry.
Minister at the Cabinet Office, Minister Chloe Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the infected blood inquiry is a priority for this government. The infected blood tragedy of the 70s and 80s should never have happened, and the victims of this tragedy who have endured so much pain and hardship deserve answers. This government will ensure that the inquiry has the resources it needs to complete its work as quickly as a thorough examination of the facts allows. We are committed to making sure that all those who have suffered so terribly can have the answers they have spent decades waiting for, and that lessons can be learnt so that a tragedy of this scale can never happen again. We want to make sure that all those who need to contribute to the inquiry can do so. The Inquiries Act allows for the Chair to make awards for legal representation for the inquiry itself once it is formally established, in other words, after the terms of reference have been set. We know that the inquiry chair intends to make early provision for core participant designation and legal expenses awards after the inquiry is formally set up. So the government is not denying funds for legal representation at the inquiry. These funds will be available as soon as possible after the inquiry is up and running. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that ministers have decided that reasonable expenses properly incurred in respect of legal representation for the purpose of responding to the consultation of the infected blood inquiry on the terms of reference prior to the setting up date will be awarded. Any claims will be handled by the solicitor to the inquiry, and it will be for that solicitor to determine these expenses. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that is good news to the House this morning. I know that the chair of the inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, is keen to ensure that all of those affected by this tragedy have a chance to make their voices heard. I know that last night he held a meeting with interested groups, and that he is continuing to engage with those who are affected and the bereaved families. Sir Brian wants to ensure that the consultation process is as user-friendly and inclusive as possible, and indeed such that legal advice should not be a necessity for being able to respond to the consultation on the terms of reference. He wants to ensure that everyone has the chance to share their views, which will inform the terms of reference. Mr. Speaker, we do believe that this is an exceptional circumstance, with thousands of people who have been fighting for years to get answers as to why this terrible tragedy has happened, and to be part of ensuring that such a tragedy could never happen again. I know that the whole House welcomed the fact that the government has established this public inquiry, led by a judge, to provide the answers that victims and families have had to wait for. I, Mr. Speaker, and others here today, I am sure, will continue to play our parts passionately for our constituents.
Diana Johnson.
Well, can I start by thanking the Minister for that response to the urgent question? I just wish that that decision had been made earlier. Can I just say to the Minister, as she outlined in her remarks, this is a group of people who have battled for many, many years to get to this point of having this public inquiry, and we want to make sure that the terms of reference are drafted in such a way that they will include and incorporate all the concerns that those affected have. And as the Minister will know, many of those implicated in this inquiry will have access now to legal advice and expertise in their submissions on what the terms of reference should say. And can I also just say to the Minister, the letter of the 23rd of March drafted by her civil servants, which tried to contrast Grenfell, which had been granted exceptional funding for legal assistance to the families that they're affected, saying that that was somehow more deserving than this group of people, I think has caused an enormous amount of hurt in the community. Of course, we want to make sure that the Grenfell families find out what happened, and 71 lives were lost in that case. But in this case, 2,400 people have already died, and since the announcement of the public inquiry last year, another 70 people have died. Many people are living with HIV and hepatitis C, and many are co-infected, so they're in poor health. And I'm really pleased that the Minister and the Government have accepted the argument that whilst the organisations are well funded to put their case, individuals should also have access to legal advice and get guidance. And I just want to say finally that I have met with Mr Justice Langstaff, and I believe that he will do his very best to get justice for this group of people. And again, he met with some of the campaigning groups last night, and I know that those meetings have gone well. But I hope the Minister will pay particular attention between now and when the inquiry is set up and Mr Justice Langstaff takes over the running of that inquiry, to make sure that we don't have any more of these decisions being made which put the individuals who've been so damaged by the state in a position where they feel hurt and lack confidence in what the government, I think, are trying to do, which is to have a public inquiry that instills the confidence and the goodwill of everybody.
Minister, hi.
Mr Speaker, thank you. And can I, once again, as I have done before from this dispatch box, pay tribute to the Right Honourable Lady for her work and for her campaigning and for her compassionate tenacity on this issue. And she will know that I have worked with her on that over the years, as have many other members in this House. And I'm pleased that she welcomes the news I've been able to bring to the House this morning. I would like to reiterate that ministers share these concerns and are keen to be able to get on with this inquiry as quickly as possible, and that it should be, of course, led so capably by Sir Brian, such that the constituents that we all serve can get the answers that they deserve. So I think, in answer to her questions, it might only be helpful to the House if I just state that under the Inquiries Act, it is for ministers to make such a decision on an exceptional basis as to whether funds might be made available during this preliminary stage. And that is what we have done today, because we do believe these circumstances are exceptional.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
My constituent Leslie Hughes was infected with hepatitis C back in 1970. That timescale suggests that there must be thousands of documents held by the relevant government department. Can the Minister assure us that full disclosure of all such relevant documents will be made?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, technically it is for the inquiry chair to be able to give that assurance, but government ministers and officials and the machinery of government, if you like, will be cooperating fully with the inquiry, will give evidence if asked. All relevant papers will be submitted to the inquiry. The inquiry can also request evidence under oath.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank my honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, for continuing to be a champion for this important issue, and would also like to echo the concerns that she and other colleagues in this House have raised. The victims of this appalling tragedy have been waiting decades for answers and for justice. Sadly, they continue to wait for the justice they so desperately deserve. I know the Minister's personal commitment to victims of this contaminated blood scandal, and I welcome the movement that she has made today in terms of, I think, correcting a perceived wrong that we heard about yesterday in this House. It was obviously deeply concerning, and I'm sure the Minister appreciates for many of the victims to have been informed by the Cabinet Office that they had previously been denied funding for the legal aid during that crucial period in the terms of reference. But we welcome, on the opposition side, we welcome the movement today. The letter from the Cabinet Office caused understandable upset amongst contaminated blood victims and their families, and particularly the comments relating to Grenfell. Whilst the contaminated blood scandal and the Grenfell fire are obviously very different, there are two key similarities. They have both had a devastating impact on the lives of those involved, and they should both have never happened. The contaminated blood tragedy has killed over 2,400 people, and 70 people have died since the inquiry was announced last year. I hope the Minister appreciates why the letter of the 23rd of March has caused offence, and would she be able to, on behalf of the government, apologise for that. The active participation of Grenfell victims has led to a widening of the terms of reference of that inquiry than those that were initially suggested by the Chair. So it's welcome news that victims for the contaminated blood will now be afforded that same opportunity to influence the terms of reference of this inquiry too.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I thank the opposition front bench for their support for what I've been able to announce today, and again I share her and all colleagues' keenness to see this inquiry done and done well. I have reflected on that, the letter that has been sent by my officials, and I am sorry for any concern that has been caused from it. And what I would just return to by way of explanation is that actually Cabinet Office officials were in fact expressing the normal position under the Inquiries Act, which is that, as I already explained to the Right Honourable Lady, ministers would decide by exception to be able to provide funding for this preliminary stage of any inquiry. Now, I have already explained that we certainly do see this tragedy as exceptional, and therefore ministers have made the decision that I've conveyed to the House today. But I hope, just by way of explanation, that it is clear that actually the normal position under the Inquiries Act, under the law, is that actually there would not be such funding, but we have decided exceptionally that there ought to be.
Chris Green.
Mr. Speaker, the people who know most about any tragedy are often the victims and their families. So will my honourable friend do all she can to listen to, especially with regard to terms of reference, and then deliver for those affected by the contaminated blood scandal?
I really welcome that reminder that the people that we are doing this for are those who have suffered so awfully over too many years. And so that is why I am pleased actually that Sir Brian Longstaff is moving forward with making sure the terms of reference are as they should be, are reflective of what people who have suffered need to be able to make known to the inquiry. That is the work that's being done at the moment, and I look forward to really good quality terms of reference that I or my Right Honourable colleague will present back to Parliament shortly.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I start by congratulating the Honourable Member for bringing this urgent question to the House and for her persistence in standing up for victims of this scandal, and also very warmly welcome what the Minister has said today. Getting the answers that victims of this scandal deserve requires asking the right questions and making sure that the inquiry has the right remit, and it's good that what the Minister has said means that will now happen. But I share concerns that the letter from the Cabinet Office was, as some have described, contemptuous and insulting, and how that came about should be looked at. Could I just ask the Minister again, though, is it not now time for the review of legal aid that's ongoing to be made entirely independent of government? Yes. And will she make sure that provision of legal aid for those involved in public inquiries is part of that review, including the operation of pre-inquiry funding as well?
Yeah. Minister.
Mr Speaker, I believe the Honourable Gentleman has actually just raised an issue that is not what we are discussing here today. I would be very happy to come back to him in more detail on the broader review of legal aid, but I do not believe that the issues that we are dealing with today are specifically those of legal aid, in the phrase that we commonly use that. I have explained the position, I hope, today that does apply to this inquiry, but as I say, I'll be happy to come back to him on his other question relating to legal aid.
McLean.
Speaker, I start with the words of my constituent. The miracle of childbirth tainted, forever seen as a sadness, by my advice to abort her child at 7 months old, an empty vessel of a lost life, its opportunities of normal happiness and future building gone forever, after which she was advised that she should be sterilised. How tragic. This happened 30 years ago and she still lives in secrecy. I just wanted her voice to be heard by the Minister in this place. She has not told a soul to this day. Given that she's waited for 30 years, I'm sure that she will welcome the legal aid. Can the Minister say a bit more about how much longer she will need to wait for the final answers to be given?
Yes,
Mr Speaker, that is one of the most awful things I think I've heard in my time in this place. It speaks for itself. The reassurance I can give the Honourable Lady for her constituent in terms of the timeline that is being worked to here is that the consultation will close the consultation on the terms of reference of the inquiry will close in late April. Very shortly after that, Sir Brian Longstaff will review what he has received, report to ministers. Ministers will lay back for Parliament the way forward, and thus the inquiry will be starting very shortly in those weeks after the 26th of April. as I've relayed to the House before, the judge intends to be able to conduct this inquiry as quickly as possible, constant with getting to the truth and getting to those answers. So I do hope that, in that sense, at least, the Honourable Lady's constituent will be able to draw a little comfort from what we are doing in this place.
Jamie Stone.
Speaker, in light of the Minister's helpful initial answer, I wonder if the Government and the Minister would reconsider the decision taken in April not to increase the compensation payments in line with inflation.
Mr. Speaker, I think I shall write to him on that point to be able to give him the fullest possible answer.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Victims of other scandals, such as Epilem, valproate and surgical mesh, have reported the fact that they were not always represented properly by the interested groups. Therefore, will my honourable friend ensure that those individuals that feel they're not being represented by particular interested groups have access to proper legal aid so they can put forward their case rather than just being represented by a group of people?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman actually does make a very important point here, and actually it's one that the Chair of the inquiry has also pointed at, which is that he wants people's real voices to be heard. Now, some will feel comfortable for that to be done on their behalf through campaign groups, and again, I also pay tribute actually to the work of many of those campaign groups who have walked these long miles over the years. But there will be others who would prefer to do that in their own individual way, and I do hope that the decision I've relayed to the House this morning can accommodate both. It is also the case that, as I mentioned, the terms of reference, the consultation on the terms of reference, which is still live at present, and to which I encourage every honourable and right honourable member's constituents to have a look and to take part in. The way that is produced is designed to be as user-friendly as possible, and therefore as open as possible to those who wish to respond in their own right. In any case, nonetheless, as I've said today, all reasonable expenses properly incurred in this respect will be looked at by the inquiry.
George House.
Could I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, for the dogged way in which he has pursued this matter. And can I thank the Minister for the statement that she's made today. She will acknowledge that many people who are the victims of the contaminated blood scandal are feeling angry and frustrated at the lack of progress to date. Will she therefore keep an open mind to any representations that may be made arising out of the statement that she's made today?
Mr. Speaker, certainly I will. The government is indeed keen to be able to hear any and all representations that are relevant here. Although I would say quite rightly, the focus begins to turn towards the inquiry that is to be set up, and it is for the chair of that to hear those representations really fully. What I would just say, what I would just say is this: I have said in my remarks today and indeed before that this has taken too long to come to justice, the justice that we hope can now be done. But that said, the government is now acting swiftly. I wouldn't accept his characterisation that at present the government is in some way delaying. We are not. We are getting on with the inquiry, and that is as it should be.
Mr. Robert Althon.
I congratulate the Honourable Lady and thank the Minister for her statement. Can my honourable friend confirm that the judge will really engage properly with the victims and representative groups, and can she set out what lessons have been learnt and nothing like this ever happens again?
Mr. Speaker, I know that Sir Brian Longstaff wants to do exactly that. I won't be able to answer here and today as to what those lessons learnt are. That is, of course, the work of the inquiry, but I know that Parliament will be kept fully informed of this process so that we can continue to reassure our constituents.
And Jessica Morden.
Speaker, can I also reiterate to the Minister that these families, and that includes the Smith family from Newport, whose very tragic story was told in an excellent Guardian article recently, they've been through so much, which is why it's just so important that we're sensitive to getting this process absolutely right.
Yes, I I welcome her and other honourable members who've been here both in this session this morning, Mr. Speaker, and over several other occasions in Parliament, who've been able to voice their constituents' words. I think for too many people, it has felt that they do not have that voice. Members of Parliament may be able to help in providing that, and I hope that this inquiry can also assist in providing that.
Tom Persclave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I really do welcome what my honourable friend has had to say today. As she might be aware, one of my constituents experienced real difficulties in accessing the treatment that she so desperately needed, and we've managed to resolve that. But is that ease of access to treatment something that could be considered by the inquiry?
Mr. Speaker, the inquiry will specifically be about the cause and conduct of the problem as it's unfolded over the years. I think my honourable friend will be aware, and indeed I think the House will be aware, that there are, of course, other sort of present-day policy questions around what is available to the victims of this scandal. I know that my colleagues in the Department for Health and Social Care will have listened to what he has said there today and will be keen to be able to continue to provide that assurance to the House also.
Mr. Andrews-Slaughter.
The Minister will realise that levels of trust from those affected by the contaminated blood scandal in the government and other authorities are very low, not least because they have been literally shortchanged over so many years. So while today's announcement is good, will she say that the government will make funds available going forward, and in particular to fulfil any recommendations made by the inquiry?
Well, the inquiry, as I've already said, most certainly will be fully resourced and fully facilitated by the government. I will, for rather obvious reasons, refrain from commenting on what the recommendations of the inquiry might be. I cannot do that here today, but I have confidence that we will return in this place to discussing what needs to be done afterwards, and that we will give that our very, very fullest attention.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I thank the Minister for her statement, but I think we should be very grateful to the Honourable Lady for Kingston Hull North for her dogged perseverance in this matter for us in this House, but tell you more so for the people outside this House as well. Thank you very much. Minister, will the legal aid in terms of reference be extended to the victims of the contaminated blood scandal in Northern Ireland who have been greatly disadvantaged and health affected, and who equally qualify for the financial assistance that the Minister has referred to today?
Mr. Speaker, I know that honourable members touched on this at the last moment that I was here with the House, updating them on this inquiry, in the sense of the way in which the inquiry needs to respond to the needs of victims in all of the nations of our country. I will be happy to write to the honourable gentleman, and indeed other representatives of constituencies in Northern Ireland, Scotland or Wales, should they have such questions, to be able to set out exactly what the situation will be for their constituents.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, a victim of the contaminated blood scandal, asked the Minister the following question. Now that we've acknowledged in Parliament a cover-up, illegal research, that the Prime Minister has used the word scandal, and that the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State has said that this should never have happened, why are these dying victims still waiting for compensation? Why won't the Cabinet show leadership? And at what point does it increase the insult by failing to acknowledge government liability for what has been described by the Prime Minister as a scandal?
Mr. Speaker, we are having an inquiry to answer these questions.
Pete Green.
I thank the Minister for her announcement this morning. It is important that the terms of reference are considered widely. My constituent has not only suffered from receiving contaminated blood at the time of the birth of her daughter in 1986, but further injustice because the medical records have been lost. Does the Minister agree that it is important that she is able to make the case for the fullest possible terms of reference, and that her announcement today will help with that?
The Honourable Lady gives us yet another example of the ways in which people have suffered in this terrible saga over time, and I do hope that her constituents' experience will be able to be reflected in the terms of reference. Again, I would urge her to encourage her constituents and all right honourable members to do so, to complete the form. It is extremely easily accessible on the inquiry's website. To be able to ensure that their voices are properly heard, and that the inquiry can then proceed to do its full job.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, my constituent Sue Sparks wrote to me and described as crass and insensitive the letter that had made the comparison with Grenfell. And could the Minister perhaps do two things today? She's rightly rowed back from that position. Could she also undertake perhaps to consult with my honourable friend, the member for Kingston-upon-Hull North, in future before the Cabinet Office issues letters of this kind? And secondly, could she apologise for the hurt that's been caused by the letter that was issued?
I think the right honourable gentleman would have heard me do so earlier on, but I'm happy to say again that I am sorry for concern that's been caused by that letter. I will, though, reiterate, just in case he missed it, the explanation that I did give a little while ago, which is that actually my officials in the Cabinet Office were carrying out what is actually the normal legal position in terms of inquiries, which is that ministers would decide by exception whether to be able to provide funding for this preliminary period, for legal assistance in this preliminary period. And that is Section 40 of the Inquiries Act that I'm referring to there. But I welcome once again his reminder that the Right Honourable Lady for Kingston-upon-Hull North has done so much work here. I am happy to meet with her at any time to discuss these issues at hand in a way that is appropriate around the work of the inquiry.
The Minister has made a gracious and positive response to my honourable friend for Kingston-upon North today. But could she indicate to the House whether there is a cap on individual financial support in the consultation period and, crucially, in the actual inquiry period?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I have said to the House today is that it will be for the solicitor to the inquiry to determine these expenses, so I am not in a position to directly answer his question today. As I say, my colleagues and I have decided that reasonable expenses properly incurred in respect of legal representation for the purpose of responding to the consultation of the inquiry on the terms of reference will be awarded.
Drew Hendry.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for Kingston-upon-Hull for bringing this issue, and indeed for the Minister for accepting the issue and for her tone this morning. Since being first elected in 2015, I've been in regular contact with victims of this scandal who've been deeply frustrated by the pace of the government dealing with this. Will she commit her government now to do what they can in their power to move this process on as quickly as possible with dignity and compassion for those who've been affected by this outrageous scandal?
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, yes, as I've said this morning already and have said before, we want this inquiry to move as quickly as possible so that people get the answers that they deserve and have deserved for many years.